Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Art of Move podcast with myself, Anthony Manuel, my good friend, Dr. William Raybar. We are still out here in the Canadian Rockies trying to find the grand unified theory of human movement, biomechanics, functional fitness, just what it's like to live in a human body, how we're supposed to move it and exist within it. And today we're going to pivot off a few conversations that happened on Instagram between Dr. Will, and Bret Contreras, the glute guy, someone who I followed for a long time when I was in the strength and conditioning industry for quite some time. And, anyway, we're gonna talk a little bit about the stuff that happened with you and Bret Contreras. I'm gonna pull up his page here, but just as a quick overview, do you want to give people some background about what was going on, what the comment was, what the discussion was before I pull it up?
Yeah, it was a coach, Karlee. It's a GOATA coach. Posted a video about what was it? Rockers. So basically being on your knees and rocking back and forth and working your glutes, right? And of course, that's kind of counter to what Bret Contreras does. And there was a huge, I think, I didn't see it at first, but I think Karlee may have tagged him in it or may have mentioned him in it. And it really set him off. He put it on blast to his 1.5 million subscribers, and the comment section went nuts, right? So of course I went in there to stir things up to see, what I can gather from the info there, right? So basically what I like to do is I like to challenge narratives. I like to see how deep they're thinking. And of course, Bret eventually came on and tried to challenge what I was saying. There's a lot of telling tales there. And of course, I eventually ended up getting dogpiled by a bunch of booty models and butt pumpers who are like, no, Bret knows everything. He's a PhD. He's everything. He knows so much about glutes. And so it devolved, right? But there was some gravy there with the comments before that all happened. So let's analyze both. Let's take a look at Karlee's original post, and then we'll take a look at Bret's post.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
I think so. Yeah, indeed.
Let me try this. Let me try a different a screen share. We'll go nofilter.net. Try that. How's that? Can you see the Bret Contreras conversation?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So for people who don't have background understanding of what a rocker is, in the GOATA movement system, there's the idea that if you have your hips behind your rib cage, your center of mass is back, and so your posterior chain, including your glutes, so you see, she actually does have a clip of Bret Contreras demonstrating hip bridges and glute bridges, and so she deliberately called him out, so he's live reacting to it.
Wait, can we go to Karlee's first to see what she put in her comment section, because that's pertinent to the whole thing?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we definitely will. So let's open up Instagram, pull up Coach Karlee, and see what she was talking about. So the GOATA position is basically don't do hip thrusts because. So how to do rockers, booty, back chain, Battlestar Galactica. We're talking about glutes, the powerhouse of the body, the propulsion unit, a staple in our drive gear. Whether for aesthetics, fitness, or athletic performance, we all understand the importance of a strong back chain for power, speed, and strength. However, modern modalities to achieve glute glory are missing a key component: motion application. Targeting a specific muscle without a model for reference, without application, can do more harm than good. The best movement model to mimic while training are the most secure systems: body that wait, rest, and locomote fluidly and pain-free. The rocker is an instinctual movement used in our early childhood development to build and prep ourselves for forward motion, crawling, and walking. Learning how to operate the pelvis in motion by loading the glutes without hip thrusting is key. Master this and every detail will become booty day. Benefits of rocking include strength, glutes, spinal erectors, hamstrings, length, opens up the feet and ankles and hips, soothes and decompresses, primes the system for efficient athletic movement, build without breaking. So this is this is a good context setter because, GOATA movement has the idea that you don't hip thrust. You don't have that level of glute extension that you see in a hip thrust in the locomotive pattern. And they try to train fractals of the human locomotion pattern in movements like a rocker. And so you see when she's demonstrating the exercise, her hips are way, way behind her. her whole posterior chain has to activate and engage and flex in order for her to maintain stability in that position or hold herself up. And so she's doing a lot of muscle activation through the angling and positioning of her joints, which emulates the locomotive pattern first and foremost, right? So that's the context. Anything that you have to add to that there, Will?
Yeah, it really shows that she puts it in context. She's like, this is about motion application, right? Now you can do motion application and still get workout into your booty at the same time, right? So I don't think that the whole strength and conditioning world agrees with this in general. And I definitely don't think Bret Contreras would ever agree with this, because thrusting is what he invented, or I think he brought it to light. Maybe he did invent it, I don't know. But that is his go-to bread and butter exercise. But in that exercise, there's a concentric motion, and concentric movement doesn't happen in locomotion, like pure flexing your glutes. So imagine I'm flexing my biceps like this. Where's the potential to move now, right? So if I do this over and over again, you ever work your biceps over and over again and then you try to move them afterwards? It doesn't work out very well, right? So imagine that being your butt area. So when I used to do squats, I used to hip thrust, I used to do deadlifts, and you get that last bit of squeeze at the end, you kind of want to do that all day because it feels good, right? So another thing is specific adaptations. If you're doing that over and over and over, specific adaptations to impose demand say that you'll probably do that in during the day, and you're going to push yourself into that motion. Hips in front of your ribs, right? You'll be tight in that area, basically. When in athletic motion, when in locomotion, you want to be nice and relaxed in that area so you have potential to move. So what Karlee's saying here is, why hip thrust? Why not do an application where you're going to encode better movement mechanics while still working your booty? Now, the question is, does this work as well as a hip thrust for shaping the booty for like a bikini model, right? I think that's the context where Bret comes in, because he's protecting his intellectual property, right? He's protecting his system, where it's like, if this works, if what Karlee's doing works, then it's much more simple than what Bret's doing, and it's a threat, right? So that's kind of the way I see it there. Now, let's go over the presupposition. Actually, let's read Bret's rebuttal. Can you put his video on?
Like with the sound and everything?
Yeah. Is that possible?
It is possible, but I don't know how well you'll be able to hear it. Let's see if I'll refresh the page and I'll put the sound on. Can you hear that?
Let's be real, y'all. The phrase isn't forced.
Yeah, not really.
Okay.
It's unfortunate, but it's fine.
Yeah,
what I was going to say is, there's some simple body language cues, right? He does a body language rebuttal, and when she says don't hip thrust, he goes nuts. At the end, he shows his teeth like he's angry, right? It's like a psychological body language cue, right? So he's obviously thinking, he's in his head, this is just another influencer. He's in the know. He's a PhD. These people are ridiculous. They're trying to work off my clout and just chase my followers, right? So I believe he actually says this, but let's read his actual statement here.
Yeah, I'll read the caption, and I'll also add a little bit of context that he put after in his stories as well. So the caption of his reaction video to the Rockers, where he was actually pictured cueing and coaching a hip thrust: modern fitness influencer tactics. Fearmongering, bold statements, ultra confident, elaborate pseudo-biomechanics. Imagine telling people this is the best exercise to strengthen your glutes, despite having no evidence, while also insinuating that they should avoid bridges and thrusts on the premise that they compress the spine, while conveniently not mentioning that the highest compressive and shear forces on the spine in the literature involve squats and deadlifts. There's no way she actually even believes this. My squad never had to build up to a 315 by 20 rep hip thrusts. They could have just done these band rockers and built just as much mass. Also, we don't have to bash exercises in order to promote other exercises. TikTok algorithm era 2022. So just to add some extra context, in his stories, he said, hey, I saw that a lot of you guys saw the The post that I made, I wanted to give some extra context. I am not for bashing exercises. I have nothing against the rocker. I want to try the rocker. What I don't like is people, smack talking exercises that are effective and safe and that work well in order to promote their own stuff, right? And so he's like, I got nothing against this person. I'm just pointing out, a tendency in the fitness industry for people to fearmonger and to bash other things in order for it to look good. Now, the question of whether or not he's kind of doing this in terms of his reaction video is up to question. But let's talk about like the fear-mongering, bold statements, ultra confident, and elaborate pseudo-biomechanics thing. If we look at Karlee's original thing, I don't think that she was necessarily fear-mongering, and the pseudo-biomechanics thing, that a lot of people say that GOATA is pseudo-biomechanics because it's oriented around observation of locomotive movement patterns and like interpretation of slow motion video, as opposed to academic literature on modern biomechanics. We've talked extensively about that on other episodes, but in terms of the bold statements and the fear mongering, I think that Karlee actually did a really good job of putting it in context, where she was saying, hey, like, if you want to train your glutes, train them in relation to our native function. And here are our native functions. And I think that was actually quite, I didn't see like a huge amount of fear mongering necessarily, just that there are safer and better related to biomechanics exercises that you can choose that don't involve putting, a 315 pound barbell on your hips.
Yeah. In terms of the fear mongering, that's just a word, fear mongering, right? But what if you are actually encoding poor biomechanics into your nervous system when you're doing a hip thrust? Like, I actually believe that, right? So when you're doing heavy hip thrusts, you're specifically adapting within your nervous system to concentrically contract your glutes, which almost never happens in reality. You're not holding a hard concentric contraction, especially with your heels down, bridging your butt up. That like literally never happens. That type of tension never happens in real life unless you're bridging someone up in wrestling. I know that you can come up with a whole bunch of examples like that. Like somebody said sex, somebody said wrestling. It's like, what are you doing most of the day? For most people, what would be the safest way to train, right? Now, a lot of people will say, well, it's unloaded. You're not loading the spine in vertical compression. Therefore, there's no compression on the spine, but you're still shearing your spine and you're still promoting that hips forward position, which by logic, like literally watch me stand here. My back is being compressed as I stand, right? So
with your hips pushed and shoved forward.
I do that. They'll say you're doing this or that, but if I promote a hips forward position, you're shearing your spine. And if you're promoting that with the heavy lifts that you're doing over and over and over again, which he promotes, then it is detrimental to your mechanics. He can put an EMG, he can put whatever on his back and show that the muscles are contracting and that they're working hard, but he's mixing up concentric contraction and doesn't even understand or apply tensions throughout the body with regard to fascial forces, fascial recoils, how the body actually carries itself in reality. Okay, so the actual elaborate pseudo-biomechanics are the mechanics that he puts forward. I don't care that he has a PhD. It just shows how easy it is to get a PhD. It's literal proof. He probably did an online, it's that easy to get a PhD. Just go online, do your online studies, you get a PhD. Now, back to the actual studies. If you don't have the observation, if you don't take observation into account, and I've watched a lot of his videos, it's strength force curves, it's vectors, and it's muscle-centric lever models. And that's what's promoted in biomechanics for the most part. Okay, those type of theories are promoted for actual studies. Okay, so that's how they design their studies around that. They don't take fascial forces into account. They don't take rotary mechanics of motion into account. They don't even know that you should be able to, that you could do that, or that you should take locomotion as a priority, right? So when you heard his debate with Naudi Aguilar 3 or 4 years ago, he even says, yeah, I don't really believe in the fascial model. So he referenced, of course, Tom Myers, which you can have that straw man argument that fascial forces equals Tom Myers lines, but it doesn't. Okay, so like when a person does a cadaver, takes apart a cadaver, you can see that there's fascia. Fascia should be accounted for, but is not being accounted for by biomechanists or anatomists in the whole. So it's not being put into studies. So they just account for muscles, which when we talk to Gil Headley, when we talk to an actual anatomist, they're like, it doesn't actually work like that because you can cut it anywhere. You know, like you're cutting your own muscle out and saying this force goes from here to here, but that's only a model. Okay, so who's actually working with the pseudo-biomechanics here? You can argue it's definitely Bret, but possibly Karlee too, right? So
little column A, little column B, right?
Exactly.
In terms of the precision, anyway, right? Because we could break it down, and we could probably, like you said, you could find different arguments and different angles for either perspective. But you know, one camp is not necessarily accounting for fascia. The other one is not also accounting for the nuances and the detail of the fascia as well. It's hard to account for fascia because it's hard to dissect it. We talked with Gil Headley and talked a little bit about his experience in trying to create novel ways to dissect cadavers so that you can preserve and understand fascia. But the networks are so intricate and so intense that it's very, very difficult to actually map out where these forces, how this tissue could affect or implicate forces transferred throughout the body. It's not a simple thing. You know, like in terms of just cutting open the human body and figuring out, okay, well, this connects here and that must create this tension. And, you know, it's hard to do, right? So the pseudo biomechanics thing, I think it's everyone's kind of taking their best stab at it, right? More than anything else. You know, there's no hard science of biomechanics, and I'll state that publicly. Like, I don't see any hard evidence of that accounts for all the variables that would satisfy us to say that there's like a hard science of biomechanics right now.
No, there's definitely not a hard science of biomechanics. Bret would say there is, but there's not. And through common sense, through actual mechanical principles, because in science, what the biomechanists go on right now is studies. But you can also go on mechanics. You can also go on mechanical principles. That is a science, okay? So when your butt goes back, tension is gained within the fascia. When the butt goes forward, the farther I go forward, the more I have to contract at the glute in order to shove my hip forward. So that's a concentric contraction. So the potential for elastic recoil is farther or greater when your butt is farther back. Try to push your butt back into a deadlift position. I'm going to say deadlift, but really a hip hinge. And you'll see and you'll feel the tissue get tight there. So there's a potential for recoil when the tissue's tight. That's how people jump. That's how people sprint. That's how boxers push back their hip when they're punching. They don't go like this and punch. It's this and punch, right? You push your hip back in order to gain fascial recoil. So one is actually reality. The other one is a model. Take an EMG. You get more muscle activity from a thrust, therefore thrust, right? And therefore thrusting is better than bringing your hips back, okay, into a rocker, because you can get more force on those muscles. But is that conducive to locomotion? So again, we're looking at a locomotion model versus a muscle-centric model.
Right. And, you know, Bret's argument was too, it's like, oh, like, you're going to tell me that my clients and all the people who have trained with me, they didn't need to build up to a 20 rep, 315 pound hip thrust. All they had to do was do these banded rockers and you would get as much muscle hypertrophy. I don't think that she's saying that, you know, it's going to be as effective for muscle hypertrophy as loaded hip thrust. But I think what she's saying is that this exercise can still build a certain degree of musculature with enough volume and stimulus while also still relating better to gait mechanics and just general biomechanics, period, you know, of the hip. So what I'd love to do is kind of go deeper into it a little bit and go into some of the comments that that you put forward first, and then that people responded to you with. So when you concentrically smash your hips forward, when do you concentrically smash your hips forward in a real life situation like a hip thrust? You'll teach your body and nervous system to do this if you continuously thrust your hips in order to obtain a bigger booty, the said principle. In fact, when do you ever purposely concentrically contract your glutes in real life? And as we just previously talked about, there is no real situation where you're like actively squeezing your ass for the sake of movement, right? One guy said, may not be direct to your question or some ignorance on my part. If you've ever had to drag someone in real life, you would definitely feel it in your glutes and want your hips forward. I've never felt dragging a person in my glutes. It's usually quads, but I'm leaning back. I'm usually like arms under their arms kind of thing and dragging them backwards, kind of like a backward sled drag that Ben Patrick would do. But maybe he's talking about dragging some like pushing a sled forward or dragging something.
But the hip thrust isn't that, though.
It's not.
Concentric. You're laying on your back concentrically, smashing your pelvis forward in a bilateral stance. That's not locomotion as your hips forward. I didn't say that didn't happen. I'm saying I was trying to, like, if you go back to my comment there, I was trying to almost be hyperbolic. I'm like, I wanted people to think and actually give me examples, because I knew that there would be probably some ridiculous examples come up, but there's not going to be any good ones coming up, right? So you're going to do it to get better at hip thrusting. You're going to do it in specialty situations like wrestling if someone's on top of you. You're going to do it more in lifting context, really.
And that's ultimately what it boils down to. It's going to make you better at lifting, right? Like some people are saying, I can't tell if this is serious or not, but in case it is, you've heard of sex, right? Well, I don't know about you, but even when I'm having very vigorous sex, I'm not squeezing my ass to thrust harder. Like it's not like something that I'm actively doing, like concentrically squeezing my glutes in order to hip thrust this person that I'm having sex with as hard as fucking possible. I don't need to do, a 315 pound hip thrust for 20 reps to be effective at having sex. And like you put out, you're like, yeah, sex is good. Sex is more rhythm and not thrusting with full force. You can also move your hips around like a dancer without fully thrusting your hips forward like a robot. Also, I said almost never. So, fair points.
Yeah, they're reaching for straws there, right? And I kind of knew that was going to come up. He's working with like the booty model crowd here, and like you can see where the thought process is at. Can you go? Yeah.
I wanted to go to this comment in particular. Yeah. You said the more you lift, the more concentric application becomes relevant. There's not many examples outside of this, though. It comes down to first principles. I know the person posting, and she has locomotion as a priority. Therefore, hips staying behind back, as in back chain movement, is optimal, which thrusts promote the opposite. I doubt hip thrusts promote muscle. I don't doubt, I think is what you're meant to say. Yeah. I don't doubt that hip thrusts promote muscle hypertrophy, but at what cost? There are many more variables I haven't mentioned, but could, if you're interested. Thoughts?
Yeah, so with that one, it's tough to argue in this context because they don't know Karlee's first principles and they don't know my first principles, right? So they're assuming we're arguing off Bret's first principles of making muscle bigger. Everybody thinks that if you work a muscle in different directions and different force vectors, then you automatically bring that into your movement, which is completely not the case, right? And it's much more specific than that, as we've talked about for the last 90 plus episodes, right? So it's very hard to argue without understanding the first principles. Karlee understands Bret's first principles. I'm going to assume 10 times more than Bret understands Karlee's, right? So because we all came from this lifting world, it's all, I used to be a fan of Bret's, right? So I understand this, and being a CrossFit coach, power lifter, all that, I understand where they're coming from much more than the opposite. I don't know if they want to understand the locomotion world, the biomechanics world, because they call it pseudo-biomechanics.
Because it's I was going to say, they just immediately dismiss it as pseudo-biomechanics, right? And it's interesting, this guy, Wind, Love, and Smile, said that you're better off talking about functionality in like a CrossFit post or within the CrossFit sphere, because within the aesthetics and hypertrophy galaxy, you're basically in the wrong place. people are going to dismiss it and they don't care about functionality necessarily. But they that being said, I also see people who say they don't care about functionality and they just want to bodybuild will still make the argument that bodybuilding and strength building is functional. Right?
Exactly.
They still have that where it's like, no, well, it's still functional. I'm still building muscle. I'm still making my tissues more resilient. I'm still doing this. And they will make the argument that it's functional without talking about what function, right?
Even Bret.
And I used to make that argument too. Like you could not tell me that a back squat was something that was going to mess me up in the long run. You couldn't tell me that. I'd be like, well, it's making me fucking brace my core better. I'm building, resilience, and I can withstand pressure and like it's like I'm more force output, man. I can produce more force than you. That was always my argument. It was a force game, force and hypertrophy, load. That's what they look for, or at least that's what I looked for when I was following these guys. So, one of the things that you said is you disagree with Bret in his comments. It's like it's very full of straw man arguments, right? And your ass will grow with hip thrust, but it has negative repercussions on your body, which he isn't honest about or he's unaware of, right? People can do what they want, right? That's always been our stance when we're doing this. This type of investigation. It's like we're not saying do one thing or another. We're just saying there are repercussions to doing anything as it pertains to your body, and everything is going to have some sort of specific adaptation. Any stimulus that you go through is going to have a specific adaptation. So this guy Canoops wants to see evidence that gluteal hypertrophy and or hip thrust specifically done correctly, whatever you want to call correctly, has negative repercussions or are any more risky than other exercises. So
with this, he wants me to lay him out a study, right? Which, I mean, like, again, that's not how it works. This is done through observation, right? In the study game, in the researcher PhD game, they hand each other studies. They're like, what about this study? What about this study? What about this study versus this one versus this one? The regular person, one, couldn't participate. And two, the researchers cherry pick their studies, and half the time they haven't read the other guy's study. They just take it on word. Okay. So you're either a huge nerd with it and you've read everything, and when you're doing that, you don't understand actually observing because it's not in the literature. Actual observation is not in the literature, and actual looking at mechanics and figuring out if this bone rotates this way, there has to be a force here. Okay, so that is more common sense to observation. That is not anywhere in the literature. That's not even understood that you should do that. They only take science as papers. But science is also mechanics. That's like actual engineering and actual mechanics are more reality than papers. Okay? You can do both. Like sometimes there's good papers, but a lot of them are trash. Okay? Many papers are trash. So I take the stance that I read the paper, and if it's good, then it's good. But a lot of the times the methodologies are just not very good at all. I'm actually going to go through Bret's papers and see what's what, right? But again, his world is going to be strength force curves, EMG studies on how much the muscle contracts based on lever system, which isn't reality. Okay. And it's going to be a lot along those lines. What makes you faster in a 20 meter? This has nothing to do with mechanics, with actually making mechanics better. But then he'd go, what are you talking about? I don't see that in the studies. You can't do that. So the paradigm isn't even there, right? So it's hard to argue. My rebuttal to this kind of brings back that point. He asked for evidence. So I was like, what is your preferred level of evidence? So that would stump anybody listening, because as soon as they hear evidence, they hear paper, right? So they're like, level of paper, level of study? No. Evidence could mean any evidence brought forward, which is observation of movement, slow motion, frame by frame, what is happening thousands of times over and over and over again. Now, again, you saw that ACL tear, I believe it was, football player. I can't remember who it was. It's going around everywhere in social media. Again, Inside Edge. Challenge anybody again to show a inside ankle bone high ACL or Achilles tear. Please show that black swan counterexample. It would make GOATA look really bad. Nobody's done it yet. I wonder why. counterexamples coming over and over and over again. With that said, they don't understand that there's different types of evidence.
Yeah, and let's talk about the different types of evidence that you said you'd present in this situation. You said, I'll start with a simple logical inference. I'll use a well-known biological principle, the said principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. You'll specifically adapt to concentric dominance over time with high nervous output, along with your nervous system favoring this position, concentric dominant glutes, push hips forward. This principle is the reason that people who practice movement can perform those movements. Also in the real world, why you notice people who perform similar systems of working out, bodybuilders and powerlifters, for example, moving very similarly, right? And this is kind of where Bret Contreras chimed in himself and talked a little bit about, and again, when you're talking about, well, this is the level of evidence that I'm bringing forward, Bret's saying, well, there's no reason to speculate or rather use your level of evidence because there's research showing positive transfer from hip thrusts to sprinting acceleration, broad jumps, squats, pushing forward, and more. It's highly functional, even if it doesn't appear so.
Wait, let's talk about that a little bit. Because he completely dismissed what I said, which is logical inference. Logical inference means let's take the logic from in a chain and work it through, right? Because he wants to argue on papers, right? I'm not going into that world because it's not very good. There's not very good papers, and we're seeing something different in observation. He's just like, there's no need to speculate. So he just like, my logical inference, observations, and literal logical inference was just swept away and said, you're speculating. There's research showing, again, hip thrusts, sprint acceleration, like I said, broad jumps, power. How much power can I put through in the short-term movement? Squats. Oh yeah, hip thrusts are making you better at lifting. Shocking. Pushing forward. These are all like you're moving an external variable or trying to gain as much power in a singular movement or a singular motion in an athletic context where I'm talking about longevity of movement with proper mechanics of motion.
So with his thing where it was, he dismissed it saying, hey, there's actually research showing positive transfer. It's highly functional, even if it doesn't appear so. Again, talking about the function of these specific movement patterns. And again, you pointed out that it's not speculation, it's logical inference, right? It's the said principle with logical inference. Notice that your metrics are anesthetics. And
I meant to put aesthetics.
Aesthetics and short burst specialty activity. So hypertrophy and short burst activities that require specifically power output. What's in question is the variables toward movement mechanics that are performed the vast majority of the time, locomotion being the priority. Now, this is going to be things that like people are just not going to understand when they read. There's a lot to this, and you might have to go through all 90 of our episodes to kind of, get to the meat and potatoes of this. We've been thinking about this and talking about this for a long time. Concentric glute activity is not the primary role in the vast majority of movement and locomotion. I don't deny the transfer of application to short burst power. The mechanics of movement are rotary in nature, especially at the hip complex. What is the evidence that hip thrusts will assist the mechanics of locomotion? And so your question is, where's the evidence that it will help the mechanics? Now, the issue is the evidence that they're putting forth do not concede the idea of the mechanics of locomotion being rotary, especially at the hip complex, right? Like you said, their biomechanical model is predicated principally on lever systems, right? And so it's power output, levers, how much ground contact time you have in a sprint. These are all the factors that they're considering when they're measuring different units, right? And I could be straw manning, like, call me out whenever, whoever's listening and you think that I'm being short-sighted and I'm not considering variables that I should be, just let me know, like leave a comment, right? Because I'm like, I don't know everything either. These are the things that I'm learning and thinking about. And so again, it's interesting because you ask, what is the evidence that hip thrusts will assist in the mechanics of locomotion? Bret's answer is there are literally a few published studies showing this. Acceleration is mostly concentric hip extension. You knoweth not what you saith.
What? First off, I'm not talking about acceleration. I'm talking about mechanics. I can't believe a biomechanics PhD would not understand that that's not what I'm asking when it's clearly I'm not asking about acceleration. Okay. Like, notice that he always wants to go back to short burst activity, specialty activity, or aesthetics, or like nothing to do with actual mechanics of motion. There's a denial of the natural mechanics of motion being rotary and spiral in nature, that there's actually rotary movements that happen in observation that aren't accounted for in biomechanics. So he will go back to aesthetics. He will go back to acceleration, short burst activity, EMG studies that mean almost nothing, that are poorly conducted. It's a cop-out. And he cites studies. There's a few of them. It's like, where are they? Let me see them. You know, like,
well, I asked him, right? I was like, hey, can I see these papers and studies for my own reference when discussing these topics? And I didn't see anything. I don't know if he answered, but like, if he answered and cited some studies, we could pull them up and we could actually look at the methods section and we could see how they're measuring things. It's funny because when I searched up, I did a bit of Google searching for this episode, and I tried to find some papers on hip thrusting as it relates to sprinting performance. And it's funny because a lot of the studies that I found only measured sprint performance against of the effects of hip thrusting as measured against squats. So it wasn't even just it was like, what's better, hip thrusts or squats? It wasn't just like, what's better, hip thrusts or practicing sprinting without weightlifting. It was specifically that, right? And so the variables are harder to test. So just going back to your response here, where mechanics do not equal acceleration, high speed acceleration as a metric is a specialty movement which 1% of the population participates in. Locomotion is for everyone. Breaking down the variables of movement mechanics is not favorable to hip thrusting, which is why you appeal to studies that only look at the variables of speed, jump, power, acceleration, instead of rotary locomotive mechanics. These studies, which you allude to but don't take rotary mechanics into account. If I'm incorrect, please link the relevant ones. So you were going to say something?
I said burn.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's pretty scathing. Again, I'll ask if there's any evidence that hip thrusts either improve or are safe with regard to mechanics. Glutes are not concentric 99.9% of the time, but nice try on the handful examples you can give. I can literally give 100 counter examples where fascial integrity provides more relevance in motion.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's where it really went off the rails, because everyone else was just asking poor questions after that. And notice Bret didn't really respond anywhere here, because
I'm looking
it's not favorable for him to respond. First off, I asked for evidence. I wasn't just talking about papers. Any evidence that hip thrusts improve your mechanics, he's not going to go there. And like the guy said way above, you're in a different world here, bud. You're in the aesthetics game. You better stick to your own functionality. Well, Bret is trying to dip into functionality because he conflates pumping your butt repetitively in a singular plane of motion with two legs on the floor, hip thrusting, as being, because it works the glutes in a concentric dominant fashion, that will make you better at motion. Okay. Functionality. Again, we don't even know what functionality is. No one's defined it, right? So I think he's the one being presumptuous here. We should probably go through like a list of what his presuppositions would be, what we believe his presuppositions would be, right? What do you...
Go ahead. No, please.
Yeah, so his presuppositions are, one, and I'm just going to list them off the top of my head, that if you have an EMG, if you put electrical signal onto your glutes and you do a hip thrust, that electrical signal is very high, therefore it works the muscle very good, or at a very high level, therefore it will transfer into athletic motion or athletic context. And it is a better exercise that another exercise, let's say the squat, you put the EMG on a squat, it has less activity, therefore the thrust is better. Right?
Right. So it's
why don't I design a study where I go squats versus hip thrusts, and then we'll see who's faster in a 20-meter run, and then that'll prove that the hip thrust is really good. Like, literally that is the level of study that they're conducting, right?
So let's actually design a hypothetical study that could demonstrate this better. If you were going to conduct a study that demonstrated, the impact of hip thrusts on locomotive mechanics, how would we design that study? How could we design something better? Because I'm not one for just complaining about how poor things are. I like offering other solutions and suggestions, right? So obviously the variables that they're accounting for don't consider fascial mechanics. They don't consider that elastic recoil that we talk about. They don't account for rotary mechanics within locomotion. So how could you design a better study to demonstrate how hip thrusts affect mechanics?
Yeah, so we can look at the what the actual through observation, okay? Like using actual observation, forget about EMGs, forget about all that. We have scenarios where a person, let's say, is using a sprint on a treadmill or preferably on a different variables, actually. Different variables, different cutting and moving. Is the person able to cut and move their hips in a dynamic fashion as they perform an exercise? Because my assertion is that the locomotion would be more rigid, right? And the movement would be more rigid. So we can capture this on high definition camera over a period of time and measure the rotary mechanics of each of the joints and how they move together. That's just off the top of my head there.
Right. And so you would almost like measure the joint angles in locomotion in different scenarios, in a sprint, in a jog, in a cutting scenario, in a walking situation. You would kind of look at the articulation of specific joints. You would measure joint angles. You would put little, you would measure all those different variables, and you would observe the actual mechanics and the effects on the mechanics of certain locomotive oriented tasks before and after, like a training period using hip thrusts, and then maybe using functional training systems.
Exactly. And
that's actually a good study. I would cite that study.
And that's actually just off the top of my head, right? Like you can do a retrospective study where you take people who are known to have hip thrusted a lot. Okay, this isn't going to be perfect, but now there's thousands of videos. Let's watch them actually move, and we can measure it just straight off YouTube, right?
Right.
And we can see people who have done motions more like Karlee, right? So let's say GOATA practitioners, functional patterns. I'm not going to say they're the exact same, but they're more along the lines of taking way more variables into account. And let's see how they actually move. Now, Bret's going to go back at this point. I think Bret would be like, but I just want to work with bikini models. Like
which is fair, man. Work with
yeah, no, exactly, right? Like stay in your lane, dude. Like you're literally trying to dip into every lane because you have these weak studies. You think that like functional mechanics is your game too. It's really not. You're not taking very many variables into account. Okay, so I would say the same thing that was said to me. Stay in your lane, right? If you want to do the butt pumping, getting your butt bigger, go ahead, right? Like you're in that game, and I'm not going to interfere with that game. I would never be able to stop that game from happening because 9 out of 10 people would probably want to do that over mechanics movement at this context. But as you get older, as movement becomes more important, as pain becomes more important, you're going to want to do have mechanics as a priority, basically, right? So yeah, there's open source, just like actually GOATA does their observations. There's open source. Right now, we can see who has done those type of workouts, okay? Hip thrusts, an abundance of hip thrusts, and let's see how they're walking. Let's see where their hips lay. Let's see where their tensions that we can even ask people, where do you feel pain? Where, like, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but basically the first design would be off the top of my head kind of the best way to do it. If you want to be scientific about it, but not everything has to go through the scientific process, ask fighters. You know what I mean? Like ask people who do martial arts. It's like, where's the study for what works better in martial arts? They'll tell you where to go. You know what I mean? Strength and conditioning is seeping into martial arts in the conditioning world, okay? But not in the actual technical world. It's two different games, right? Which is kind of analogous to this, right? One is a technical game based on mechanics, proof is right away. Does this work? Do you look better? Do you punch harder? And the other one is, trust me, bro, all the strength and conditioning is going to make you stronger when you do the mechanics. So, yeah.
When you do the mechanics. I'm going to quickly share a video since we're talking about open source stuff going on. I just found a video just from a quick, easy YouTube search. Bodybuilders versus athletes racing, right? And so you got the two bodybuilders on the far right in the middle, and we got two athletes on either side of them here. Just take a look at the difference in their running mechanics. Let's even slow it down. I'll even do the playback speed. We'll do a playback of, we'll do half the normal speed. We'll quickly do this here. On your mark, get set.
Are you turning that on?
Did you not see it?
No, it's not playing.
Oh, that's weird. That's very strange. Yeah. Let me try something else here.
Sure. Maybe it was playing and I just don't see it on my screen. I'm not sure.
Let's try this. I'll do a video.
Get set.
Here.
Go. Yeah, feet.
Do you want to just turn your sound off real quick?
Sure.
And we'll do like half the playback speed. We'll go to the part where they're all racing.
Go.
You see that?
Yo.
Hey, they finna feed the game.
Go.
Big difference in the mechanics. I mean, obviously the athletes smoke. Absolutely smoke.
Yo.
Hey, they finna feed the game.
But there's a clear difference in the mechanics of someone who is naturally athletic and a bodybuilder who is focusing principally on concentric-based actions.
Yo.
Hey, they finna feed the game.
That's the cleats, dog.
For their training. Huge difference.
Who won it? Asian. Oh, that boy fast.
Asian. Who got it?
What have you noticed? What'd you notice in there?
Yeah, I mean, the athletes look way cleaner. The bodybuilders look way tighter. I mean, that doesn't exactly say much because, again, that's in the athletic context of a short burst, right? Like, I don't doubt that you get faster in a shorter burst doing hip thrusts. But what does it do to the actual mechanics of motion? And running is a specialty, okay? Sprinting is a specialty movement as well. Like, sprinting to max pace is like squatting to max pace. It's like nobody does that, almost ever, right? Like, it's a very specialty activity. So I'm talking more along the lines of what most people do: locomotion, jogging, walking, the basics of movement. If we're talking about longevity for the population, right? I'll concede that there might be a difference in athletic for young people. Okay, for very young people, it's a different game than a 40-year-old, right? So this is why you don't see a lot of 40-year-olds in, who are bodybuilders who are also athletes. You may see it when they're really young, but you won't see it when they're really old, right? So, that's my opinion on that. What were you saying? I kind of missed it because the volume was on.
No, it's all good. I was just saying that there's an obvious, definite difference in, like, you don't need an elaborate study to show that a bodybuilder and someone who principally trains in a concentric way is going to move differently than someone who is principally using their body for athletic, movement-oriented application. Like, period. Even it's interesting because I'd been doing some concentric oriented training for the last little while, and I started doing boxing recently, right? And I noticed that when I started boxing, my arms were like really slow. It's like I had to like consciously extend them and retract them, and I didn't have that kind of pop, that recoil. And as I've been practicing the dynamics and trying to like link different parts of my body, like link my hips to my rotation, to the snap and my hook, that the way that my body feels as I'm going about my day feels different, first of all, but then also, like, over time, my mechanics are different. My arms feel different. I had a friend point out that my lats are looking a lot bigger. And I thought that was really interesting because what I've been doing is like, I noticed like my lats are so tight from all the gymnastics training and CrossFit that I did that when I throw a jab or I throw my straight, it almost feels like my lats are pulling my arm back and it stops me from fully extending. So I've been doing all this myofascial release work, all this like fascial stretching stuff for hours, like hours and hours and hours, trying to release my lats, and then apply it in movement. My buddy looks, he's like, dude, your lats are bigger. What are you doing? Are you lifting again? I'm like, no, I haven't been lifting at all. All I've been doing is like, myofascial release in my triceps, my lats are on my shoulders. His speculation was all this fascial release kind of like basically loosened up some of the connective tissue that's wrapping my muscle and gave my muscle fibers more room to expand and more room to sort of engorge. And then that freedom also just ends up looking like more full, healthy muscle anyway, which I found kind of interesting. So again, like my entire training career, a lot of my movement has been concentric oriented or isometric oriented because of gymnastics.
Yeah. Like, I would say a lot of gymnastics is more isometric holds. And then it's not so much concentric motion like bodybuilding where you're just repeating concentric motions, right? Mm-hmm. I watched a bodybuilder today and I thought about it. I was like, well, I'm having this debate with the glutes. It's literally the same thing all over the body. If I do concentric motion on my biceps, I remember when I first started overhead squatting and I was also bicep curling, I couldn't put the bar over the head because the fascia and the muscles in my biceps were so shortened, either neurologically or mechanically, I'm not sure, probably a combination of both, that I couldn't extend them, right? So after a while, same thing, myofascial release, which works if that's your issue, right? Not to say you have to do it over and over and over and over and over again, but if it's your issue, then do it, right?
I mean, I'm coming up on my 1-year anniversary of shoulder surgery where I tore my rotator cuff and my bicep tendon from that exact problem. I was doing a snatch and a CrossFit workout. The fascia in my biceps and my pecs were so fucking tight that when I launched myself into this dynamic movement, rather than being able to catch it, it just tore that rotator cuff and that bicep tendon. I had a slap 4 tear. It was brutal. It's amazing because a year later I had my surgery and I've done a lot of biomech stuff and I'm like, I'd say 95% recovered. There's still some functions like I can't hang from one arm very comfortably from my right arm still, but I can still hang. I can do pull-ups. I can do basic stuff. And I'm hoping, sometime next year I'll be able to brachiate a little bit more, but I can do boxing. I don't fatigue any more in my right shoulder than I do in my left. It's very cool. It's very, very cool.
It's an interesting point you bring up there with kind of like you didn't have the room, so it went up, right? But in that motion, let's say a snatch, you have a fixed maneuver you have to do, right? And your torso stays centered. In a real life context, if my shoulder flew up, my body would orient around that because of mechanics, because I know that my body has to orient around that. Now, if I concentrically move or I isolate my shoulder all the time, even if I have the range of motion, but my body doesn't have the intelligence to know to orient around it. A very good example of this is when somebody catches you in a jiu-jitsu, let's say ankle lock. You're going to snap it if you don't roll with it. Okay? So over experience to roll with the ankle lock so that they can't lock the ankle or the knee, right? So that is an example of rolling with the energy. And the same thing happens when you move explosively. Now you're in a sport like Olympic lifting where the variables are you can't really get out of that plane of motion. So you either have to let go or what happened to you, right? And sometimes even if you don't let go, what happens to you, because shoulder injuries happen quite a bit in that sport, right? So that's just an interesting side point there that I don't think is addressed. Like a lot of the FRC practitioners will be like, you just get the range in the shoulder and make the shoulder act like a shoulder. But in real life motion, in actual movement, you have to orient your body around to actually stop yourself from getting injured.
And I actually came up with an interesting theory as to why my right shoulder injured itself too versus my left, and why I have such limited range of motion. So I have a tremendous amount of scar tissue in this wrist. You can kind of see it on camera. Like there's almost like a lump that comes out versus my other one. And I do have thick forearms from all the false grip on there, but you can actually see there's like a certain amount of scar tissue that inhibits my wrist flexion and my wrist extension. And that pulling on that fascial chain all the way down my arm, like I can actually feel when I pull my wrist back, I can feel it pull on my bicep tendon, which is kind of interesting. So I don't have the full range in that slack and that the appropriate tensions in the fascial network through my wrist and forearm. And that pulls on the fascial network in my bicep, which connects to my shoulder and causes compensations down the chain. And then I tried to do a snatch a very light snatch too, by the way. I think it was like 95 pounds. It wasn't crazy. I was like, I was warming up for a workout and I just felt something snap and I was like, fuck, I did it. I screwed up big. I was like, damn it, I'm screwed. So I think that's really interesting because, I really do believe that like sort of adhesion in my wrist and in the fascial chain all the way through my arm did affect what happened at the shoulder level.
What fascial chain? Tom Myers fascial chain? Right? Like, obviously that's a thing, right? Like I could put my arm out like this and I could just go like that with my arm and I'll feel it up here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, either that's a nerve or fascia. Like there's definitely fascia that wraps through your whole body and it's not a lever system, guys. It's just not a lever system, no matter how much you want it to be. Now you can make it into a lever system when you're lifting. And in fact, that's the best way to lift. So if you get good at lifting, you're going to get good at making your body into a lever system, which for motion, for movement, it is a full body pressure wave system using elastic recoil in a circular fashion. So in a spiral fashion, okay? And you can see this with punching, you can see it with throwing, you can see it with running, you can see it when you start moving, but when you're standing still and lifting, it's all levers, okay? So, I think that's kind of like the overall arching two thought processes there. So
final thoughts for Bret Contreras versus Karlee Owens, Coach Karlee and Bret Contreras. What I'd like to point out is that, Bret's work is highly relevant to people who are seeking hypertrophy and aesthetic work. His contributions to that particular goal are undeniable. He is the inventor. I just saw in his bio, he is the inventor of the barbell hip thrust, right? And so Bret's very good at what he does. No disrespect to Bret on that level. I just think that when it comes to biomechanics and conflating some of the hypertrophy work and some of the strength and hypertrophy and force production work to actual tangible real life, real world application movement oriented biomechanics, it's maybe a bit of a stretch, and there has to be a little bit more of intellectual honesty and deeper considerations beyond the, well, I'm a PhD and therefore I automatically know what I'm talking about situation going on. To point out what Karlee's up to. I mean, she did deliberately use a video of Bret Contreras doing a hip thrust. I know that she is against hip thrusts from a mechanics perspective, from a longevity perspective. Was she fear mongering? Was she talking about compressive forces? I think she was pretty, I'm biased. I have a preference and a bias towards functional fitness and the biomechanics. I've gotten tons of results from it. I've seen the fruits of the practice. And so I am biased towards it, but I also think that she was pretty fair in setting the context in her thing, and I don't think there was a huge amount of fear mongering. I know it would be confusing for people who are trying to build muscle and who are trying to, that was Bret's argument is like, well, imagine a beginner being like, oh, I can't do hip thrusts because they're compressive on my spine. I can't do this movement. I can't do that movement. It's like, well, okay, maybe it's a good thing that a beginner is considering their mechanics when they're approaching training. That's what I'm going to say to that.
Yeah, that's really diplomatic. I'm taking a less diplomatic stance on that. I think Bret is really incorrect on this, and I'd love to debate him on it. I doubt he'd debate me because he's got 1.5 million followers. And hip thrusts are compressive to your spine, promote shear forces through concentric action, shooting your hips forward. It's easy to see, very visible, can be logically induced from the mechanics. You almost never use concentric contraction in real life motion. However, if you want to be a butt model, hit up Bret.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, guys, I believe this is episode 90 of the Art of Move podcast, which is absolutely bonkers to me. If you guys want to catch these episodes live on No Filter Network, just go on nofilter.net. Check out our Instagram pages where we're announcing when we are doing our live episodes. So I am at anthony.manuel, Manuele. Will is at The Art of Move on Instagram. We do these episodes regularly live on nofilter.net. You can watch the replays on YouTube and hear them on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But we always prefer that you join us live and interact with us. Hit the knock button, join in the conversation, join in the debate. Let us know what's going on. And we will catch you on the next episode 91 of the Art of Move podcast. Thanks for listening, guys.
Have a good one, guys.